Welcome to the Flex Rental Solutions webinar. Today we're going to be going through the entire rental PO process. We're going to start with a basic overview of kind of the more, just the basic or more general way that you can create a rental PO, receive those items, etc. And then we're going to, after we go through that whole process, we're going to go into a little bit more of a deeper, we'll look at some more like best practices, some deeper system settings and things like that. So I want to start with just kind of showing what a rental PO is. So just like in Flex, how you can create quotes and pull sheets and all those different types of elements, you can also create a rental PO. And you can drag and drop your different inventory items onto that rental PO and send that off to a vendor, letting them know that you want to rent certain items from them. So if we go to our projects menu and look at rental POs, you can see I already have quite a few set up in my system that I've created. And so a rental PO can have a name, a vendor. We'll show you who it was created by, who the buyer is. That's just going to be a user in your system. So since this is my test system, they're all going to be me. And then they have a status too. And the status is important because when you first create one, by default, the PO will just go into PO requested status. But you can go through a workflow just like you can with a quote or a pull sheet. So you can go from PO requested to PO approved. Once you receive the items into your system, it will go into subrental received status. And then once those items have been returned, it will go into subrental returned. I thought maybe I had some of those in my system, but it looks like I don't. There might be some that are deleted, but we'll go through that process. And the reason why I wanted to start by showing PO statuses and things like that is because we have something in the system that you can do to update the PO workflow. That's called a data updater. So right now, if you look at your projects menu and click workflow, and if you don't see this on your menu, you probably just don't have permission. But right now, all POs use a shared PO workflow. And so that would be purchase orders, rental POs, etc. And that goes through just a very basic process of starting in the requested state. You can submit it for approval. Once it's approved, it can be received, etc. In the past, though, we kind of had a problem with being able to have each rental PO go into its correct status during the process of receiving and returning. So what we did is we created this data updater that if you run it, it will change the way that the workflow is set up for your POs. So just as a word of warning, I probably wouldn't run this if you've made major changes to your PO workflow. But if you haven't made any changes, then I would recommend running this receiving workflow updater, because what it's going to do is just make your PO workflow a little bit more streamlined and make sure that as you go through the different processes, especially the receiving and returning process, that the rental PO specifically will go into the right status. So I'm going to do that. First, I want to show you just where some of these settings are. If I go to project element settings for my rental PO, we're not going to go through all of the different settings here, but I just want to show you how some of them will change once I run that data updater. So first of all, we can see that my rental PO is just using the standard PO workflow. And then there's going to be a couple other settings as well in the PO intake manifest and things like that. Or the subrental intake manifest, I should say. So we'll just open that really quick, because again, I just want to show you how some things change once I run that data updater, and then we'll actually go through the whole PO process. So let's close those down, run that data updater. I'm just going to click execute. It's going to ask, are you sure? I'll say yes. And look at what happens. Now when I go back to my project elements and click my rental PO, we're just going to see a few changes that were made. So now it's using a new workflow called the PO Unified Workflow. And if we look at the workflow, reload, you can just see a few more workflows that are set up. So again, all this is just kind of background stuff. You don't necessarily need to know about it if you don't care about all the settings, but I just kind of wanted to show you what happens and how running that data updater makes your workflow a little bit more streamlined. Again, be careful if you've made a lot of changes to your PO workflow, because if you run that data updater, it will override a lot of those changes. So I do recommend most people running it, but just a word of caution if you don't want to lose any changes you've made. So with that said, let's go through the whole PO process. I'm going to start with a quote, because one of the most common ways that you'll create a PO, a rental PO specifically, is from a quote. So let's just call this my webinar quote. We'll give it some arbitrary dates. I'm not going to bother with filling in the rest of this right now. What I want to do is just add a few items to this quote and intentionally create a conflict, because a lot of times the way that you will create a rental PO is because you have a conflict. So let's say, for example, these JBL Eons. I'm going to say that I need 12 on this quote, which I believe, and I'm going to ignore my suggestions for now, but that should create a conflict for me because I only have 10 available. I'm asking for 12, so I have a -2 conflict. So the fastest and easiest way to be able to create a rental PO, in my opinion, is to just go to the conflict. You could either click the cogwheel and click conflicts, or double click the conflict box. And what you're going to have is the option to subrent. You could either just double click this subrent right here, and it's going to give you the option to look for a vendor in your contacts, or you can pre-set up some of the contacts that you know you can use to rent this item. And that's relatively easy. You just go into the inventory item itself. So I'm going to open the JBL Eon 15 model, and when I go to suppliers, I can either set up a purchase supplier preference, that might be somebody that I would purchase this item from, or down here I click subrental supplier preferences and just add a new contact. So maybe I could get this from Chris Stein. The lead time is just going to be how much time I would expect to receive it. An estimated cost to me, so it would cost me $35 to rent this from Chris. And then just click update. And look what happens if I go back and do that same thing where I double click the conflict to resolve it. I now have Chris Stein as an option. I'll probably just want to go with my cheapest option, so I could double click the name of one of these pre-configured suppliers. And you see what happens is, number one, the conflict is resolved because I have a PO that was created. And this PO is created as a child to the quote. If I double click that, you can see it filled in all of the information for that vendor with the line item information, that estimated cost. Maybe they've changed that since then, or maybe they're giving me a deal this time and it's only 20. I could change that and then send it out to the vendor, or just generate a PDF and send it to them in a separate email. But then here's that workflow I was talking about too. We could come down here and actually go through a whole workflow process where I have to submit it for approval. Then that would go into an awaiting approval status, and then somebody would come in and either approve or reject the PO. You don't necessarily have to go through that whole process, but the option to go through the workflow is there. I know some people that just create the POs and don't even bother with the workflow, but I like going through that workflow. It just kind of gives you a sense of where each PO is in its life. Remember, if we look at all these POs, we have some that are requested, some that are approved, some that have been received already, etc. You can also add and make changes to this PO. If I want to add an item, let's say that I know that I'm going to need some stands with that too, but they weren't on the quote. I could just go over here and drag and drop items into the PO. I could also add additional items to the PO using the same method that I did earlier from the quote. So let's say that I'm also adding maybe a mixer or something to this quote. I'll probably have to add several so I can create a conflict. So I need one. I could double click that, And in addition to the existing default suppliers that I set up, it also shows existing POs that are created in my system already. And I know that I could get this from Corinne already because she's listed as one of my default, but I don't want to create a whole new PO. I just want to add it to the existing one that I already have. So I would double click this. And as you see, it adds it to that PO right here. So again, this is just kind of the basic, most common way I would say to create a PO is from a quote, from a conflict on a quote. A few other ways you could do it as well. Let's, for example, create an event folder. Maybe you just have a general PO for all of the different quotes inside of an event folder. You don't necessarily have a PO for each quote. You just know that you're going to be renting a whole bunch of items. You don't necessarily need them to be associated to a specific quote. You just want to add it to the tree of the event folder. So I could come down here and say add rental PO. Enter the information here. Maybe this is a specific company that I'm renting from. I could create several different rental POs for each company that I might be renting from. And notice the need by and return by date. It's different than the ship and return date for your quote. This is when do you need it? When does it need to be returned from the vendor? Or to the vendor, I should say. But then from here, I could just drag and drop items that I need to rent. And then once I get a confirmation about the cost, of course, I could enter it here so that I know exactly what kind of costs I'm going to incur for those POs. We're not going to cover it too much in this webinar, but this also gives you information in your job costing tab. So if I go to the event folder and click job costing, now I have some expenses that are showing up because they're being pulled from whatever expenses show up on this PO. So it's a really nice way to be able to look at what kind of revenue you might be getting from all the quotes, but then also all the expenses from the different costs like POs and things like that. Just give you a nice ballpark profit loss number there. So now that we've created a few POs and we showed the different ways that you can do that, and also I can mention you could just create a PO from scratch that's not associated to any job at all. I could just go to the new menu and say new rental PO, and this would just create a standalone rental PO. Because maybe sometimes you might just be renting a ton of gear that's going to be used across many jobs, and so you don't necessarily need to associate it with the job. You could just create one from scratch like that. But now that we've looked at those different ways that you can create a PO, let's look at what you can do with those POs. Now, in all of my years of doing Flex training and working with different customers, I've seen a variety of different ways that people deal with POs in their system. Some people just don't even bother creating rental POs at all. They do that separately outside of Flex. They just deal with the vendor, and they don't necessarily need to track that in their system. Some people will create the rental PO, but strictly just for financial purposes so that they know how much cost they're incurring for a job. And you can even send that rental PO out to QuickBooks. If we find that one I created earlier and went through the workflow, I could export that as well. So some people will just stop there. But some people like to go the entire distance of the PO process in Flex, where you can actually receive these items into your system because technically you're responsible for them, so you could receive them as inventory into your system and be able to scan those items in and out to different jobs. So let's show how you can do that. Now that I have a couple rental POs created, let's go to the warehouse menu. I'm going to click receiving. This is going to show me all of my upcoming POs that I have to receive. So there's the one that we created earlier for the Corinne Lewis rental. That one had the JBL and the Yamaha mixer on there. And this is just showing me how many I've ordered, the information about that item, how many I've received so far. And that's none because I just came to the receive screen and I haven't received any of them yet. This receive screen works a lot like the different scanning screens that you have in Flex, like prep and return screen and things like that. So what I'm going to do is actually double click the item that I want to receive, and since this is serialized In fact, let me go back to this rental PO and put a non-serialized item on there just so we can see what that looks like as well. So I'm just going to drop a few 3-pin XLRs on there. But let's go back and refresh this so that that will show up. But first, let's receive some serialized items. So I'm going to double-click this JBL, and I'm going to receive each serialized unit individually. So since I have to receive 2, I ordered 2, I'm going to receive the first one. First things first, it's going to assign a barcode. If I leave this as auto, Flex is just going to use the built-in barcode numbering scheme for subrental items. And by default, that is going to be SUB and then a barcode after it. I'll show you what that looks like once I receive it. The purchase cost is just how much it cost me to rent this. I could even put in stencil or serial number information. Again, it's not required, but just if I want to be able to track that specific unit, I could put in that serial number. Click Add to Inventory. And now that one has been received. And you can see that's the barcode that was created. And I can even open this model, go to my serial numbers, and we can see that I've received several sub-rented JBLs. These are from a different PO that I did earlier, and this one is the one I just did now. So these are actually literally in my system right now with their own barcodes that I can scan in and out to different jobs. Let's go back and receive the other one. Oh, I could also print a barcode straight from here. So if I want to print the barcode that I just created for that item, I could print it to my barcode printer and then put that onto the item. But I'm just going to go to the next item and just do the same thing. Enter a serial number if I want. Add to inventory. So now it's showing me that I've received both of those JBLs. Let's go to the next item. That's going to take me to this Yamaha. Just do the same exact thing. Add it to inventory. Print a barcode if I want. But then I'll just go to the next item. And so this is a non-serialized item. It's going to work a little bit different. It's still going to use the non-serialized model barcode by entering auto. So we'll just leave that. But then I'm going to put the quantity that I'm receiving. Instead of receiving them one by one, I just put that in there. And I see a question in the chat room already about, can you put in the vendor's barcode? You can put that in. Scanning it is a little bit more tricky because the way that barcode scanners are set up in Flex, if I were to go into that field, and I've already received it, so it's not editable now, but if I were to click into there and then scan a barcode from the vendor's, from the unit that the vendor put on there, it would show up as the caret symbol followed by whatever barcode, because that's the way that we program Flex as barcode scanners. So I know some customers that have, they'll have a separate barcode scanner set up that's only going to send the actual barcode instead of any of the special symbols that Flex will send. You could probably go on the forum and ask if anybody's done that and kind of get some tips on how you can do that. But you can enter the barcode by hand. So if there's already a barcode on that unit from the vendor, you could just go in there and enter that barcode in by hand instead of putting auto, so that you don't have to print a whole new barcode. That, of course, is assuming that you're not using the same numbering scheme for your barcodes that the vendor is that you get it from, because you might have a duplicate barcode, but chances of that are pretty slim. Let's refresh this to show the other barcode that we received. And I could do the same for my mixer and XLR cable. Notice that for XLR cable, it just increases my sub-rental quantity over here. But again, I can literally use those barcodes now and the quantities that I received in sub-rentals to scan items out to this job. So let's go over here and confirm the quote. And then create a pull sheet, because I want to show you that I can actually scan those items. And this is a perfect example, because what we have here is items that I'm using most of my quantity, most of my stock, but then I'm also scanning out a few rental items too. So what we're going to see when we go to the prep screen for this pull sheet is the total quantity that needs to be sent. But if you scroll all the way over, this little SR, this is telling us that's how many need to be how many of that quantity is coming from sub-rental vendors. So that's a really useful number so that you know, oh, well, I'm only scanning 10 from my warehouse, but I'm expecting 2 others from Ultimate Audio Video. And same with this Yamaha, I'm expecting 1 out of that total of 4. So what I would do is start scanning the 10 JBLs that I own, and I'm going to cheat by virtually scanning, just for the sake of time. So I could go through and choose all of mine. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And it looks like it's counting out of that 10 some of the old sub-rented items that I had. But I could go in here now and also just choose, or I could scan the barcodes that I put onto these sub-rented items. But again, I'm just virtually scanning, so let's choose all of those 4. Some of these come from another vendor, but that's okay. So I've literally scanned out sub-rented items that I received into my system. And I could do the same with my Yamahas. I could scan out the 3 that I own, and then scan out the 1 sub-rented item that I received in my system too. And then finalize that prep. So the reason we're doing this is just because we're responsible for those items that we received, so we want to be able to track them and see exactly where they've gone. I could go to the scan log and look at those. I could see, okay, so this sub-rented item, I could even go to the specific barcode and look at the scan log there and say, well, I received it at this time and date, so-and-so received it, then it was prepped to this job, and then once I'm ready to return it, I could go to the manifest. And we're not going to talk too much about prepping and returning items. Most of you should know how to do that. But then I could go and return all those items. And again, I'm just going to cheat and return them all. But again, really what we're doing is just creating a nice paper trail of I received your item from the vendor, I scanned it out, scanned it back in, and then the last step, you can go to Warehouse Subrental Returns, find the rental PO, and actually return those items and remove them from your system. So I could double click this, say, okay, it looks good, I did a visual check, process that return. Now it's removed from my system. Let's go back to the JBL serial numbers, and it removed one of those sub-rental barcodes. Go to the next item, process the return, and just go through that whole process. There's my non-serialized. I'm processing the return of 10 of those, and then finalize my return. So if we go back to the let's find that one. Go back and look at the scan log. We have a receive, a prep to a job, a return from a job, and then a return back to the vendor. So it's really just a matter of having a nice paper trail of everything that happened to this item, so that if, let's say that the vendor says I never received it, it's 2 weeks late, I don't know where it is, you can come back here and say, well, so-and-so scanned it to be returned to you, so you could probably assume that between them doing the return scan and it being loaded to a truck and sent back, that's where it got lost. So it's a lot easier to just be able to track exactly where that sub-rented item is. Other thing you can do is look at the PO history for an inventory model. So click any inventory model over here, and you'll see over in the inventory menu this option called PO history. If you click on that, it'll just show you all the different times that this item was used on a PO. And that's useful information if you're trying to see, well, how many times do I rent this, or how many times have I had to purchase this item, just so that you can make an informed business decision of, oh, maybe I need to buy some more of these. Maybe I'm spending so much money on renting them, it would just be more worth it to actually purchase some. So that PO history can be very helpful for you. Let's look at a few other sort of more best practices and some deeper system settings that can help you through this process. And I know that we're getting a little bit short on time, so we'll get through some of these quickly. The first one, let's just create another quote In fact, I might even just use an existing quote that I know has a lot of items on there. Let's say that you have a bunch of items that you know you need to rent. You don't necessarily want to go through. In just one second, I'm going to change these dates so that we can get conflicts back. But you might not necessarily want to go through and have to resolve a conflict for each and every item and then add it to a PO. That can be pretty time consuming. So let's say that if you do have some conflicts, let's try to find something on this quote that does have a conflict. And if we can't, let's just create some, because this isn't a real life system, so we can do whatever we want. So let's say I have a bunch of these TVs that I need to resolve conflicts for. I don't necessarily want to go to the conflict resolver for each one. Let's say that I just want to add all of these to a rental PO quickly with just a few clicks. What I can do is go to this logistics view tab of the quote and I have a few options over here. This SR quantity, that means subrental quantity. SR vendor is subrental vendor. What I can do here is actually tell Flex how many I need. So this one I have a conflict of 4, so maybe I want 4 from a rental vendor. This one I need 2. And I think if I get 4 and 2 for those, it would resolve these conflicts too, but let's double check. Then I can also type in the vendor that I'm getting them from. So let's say I want to get them from Aaron. Now what this doesn't do yet is create the PO. So what I can do is add that information to as many different line items as I want. I can even go in here and bulk edit. So if I wanted to select several items, I could come over here and say bulk edit, and I could enter the subrental quantity plus subrental vendor here, and it would add that to each line item. And then after I do that, I come over to the menu here and say update subrental paperwork. I don't necessarily want to update any of these specific ones. I just want to generate a new one. So I'm not going to select anything, and I'm just going to click this button here. And it creates a new rental PO for this job. And it's going to include all the different items that I put on there. And then I believe it should at least do something with those conflicts. Yeah, it's still telling me that yellow just means that there are still shortages on this job because I have multiple line items for it. So that's just a quick and easy way to add a bunch of items to a PO without having to go through the conflict window every time. Another thing you can do is actually add those quantities and then have different vendors. So I could say I need 1 from Aaron. This one I'm getting 1 from Chris. And obviously this is not a very realistic scenario. I'm not going to get 1 VGA cable from a whole bunch of different vendors, but just to show you how this works. Now when I go and click update subrental paperwork, that would create a PO for each vendor that I entered in there. So you can have multiple vendors. So just a nice, quick, easy way to be able to do that. And as long as we're talking about quick and easy ways to do things, let's go back to our receiving screen. And let's find, I'm not sure which one is which. Let's open up this rental PO. Oh, that's the one we already did. But what I want to do is show you how, instead of having to double click and receive each one individually, if you have the right permission in your system, and that permission is in your user permission settings, most administrators should have it, inventory managers should have it, but it's called can virtually scan all items in or out. If that's granted to you or any user, then what they can do is select all items and then click scan selected items in. So what that did, if we go look at our Samsung LED, What that did is just automatically received that for quantity that I was requesting. Those are all the subrental barcodes that I just received. So it did it really fast. Now again, there's always a word of caution when we show things like receiving all or scanning all in or out at the same time, because you're not doing each one individually and there's always a little bit of room for error. So I always mention that, be careful using that, but there is that option. And I typically use that if, you receive something and you look at it and you know that it's all there. You don't necessarily have to go, touch each item and count it. You could say, I know for a fact that we got everything listed here. So you just select all and then scan selected items in. And you could do the same exact thing on the return. So if I go to subrental returns, and then just find one that needs to be returned, and that one already has been, but you get the idea. On returns, I could just do the same exact thing. Click that all button and say scan selected items out, and it would bulk return every single item. And while we're looking at fast and easy ways to be able to receive and return items, you can also use the choose from another list when you're prepping a job. So for example, if we create a pull sheet here, some of you might already know what this choose from another list is. We're not going to go through all of its functionality, but when you're on the prep screen for any job, you can click choose from another list, and what that does is it pops up a list of manifests that you can choose the items from that manifest to be able to scan from the old job directly to the new job. And what you can do is that same exact thing with the intake manifest of your rental PO. And so after I've received items from a rental PO, what it does is create an intake manifest. And we can see that up in the tree here, right? So rental PO, as a child, we have subrental intake manifest for Aaron Rodgers. I can go to my prep screen. I can click choose from another list. And instead of having to individually scan each one of those rental items that I got from Aaron Rodgers, I could just choose from another list and say, I want to choose from subrental intake manifests, find that specific Aaron Rodgers rental PO. And again, it could be either one of these. Let's try this one. And there's all those items that I received. I could just choose all and hit scan selected. And that's going to scan all those items. Scans all those items directly out to this job that I'm prepping. So again, it's just a really quick and easy way that you can receive those items in bulk and then scan them out in bulk and then return them in bulk and then return the subrental in bulk. Again, I usually recommend just doing it individually, so each item individually, but if you are already crunched for time and just want to be able to do these things quickly, then you can certainly do it that way. Some of you might be wondering though, when you click choose from another list, you don't have the option to choose a subrental intake manifest or any of these other options. There's just a quick setting to change that. If you go to your inventory menu and click inventory settings, scroll down a little bit, look for that flow inventory settings. By default, only manifests is checked as enabled, but you just need to enable any other type of manifest that you want to be able to choose from. So specifically subrental intake manifests. And then you can also choose which one is the default. The default just being when I click choose from another list, which one pops up first. But then I can choose whatever I want. So that's what you have to do if you're looking for the option to view subrental intake manifests from the choose from another list. So just as a quick review of some of this, we looked at creating a rental PO from a quote directly from a conflict. So if I have a conflict on an item, I could just double click that conflict and then find somebody to subrent it from, and that would create a rental PO. We also looked at the logistics view, how you can just change the subrental quantity, put in a subrental vendor, and then once you hit update subrental paperwork. It will create those POs for you. We looked at receiving rental POs into your system. So that would be the items that you're receiving from that vendor. We looked at how you can receive those items and actually create barcodes for those items directly into your system so that you can scan them in and out from your jobs. We looked at how you can choose from another list and choose the sub-rental intake manifest. So after you've received a sub-rental, you could just pull up that manifest and bulk scan all of them over to the job that they're going to. And then we looked at sub-rental returns, and specifically we kind of looked at both methods where you could double-click each one and return them individually, or you could click all and say scan selected items. Last thing that I really want to mention is some people say, okay, that the whole sub-rental process is great, but that's just a lot of work, and I don't have time to do all of that work. And that's fine, because we like to offer the tools that you can use in Flex, but we don't expect everybody to use 100% of the tools that you have in Flex. Some people just say, I just want to be able to create a quote, and if I put an item on a quote that I know I need to subrent, I just want there to be a way that I can tell the warehouse or tell anybody else in the system that we're not using that item from our own stock. So there's a really easy way that you can do that. It's what we call the warehouse mute. So you remember all these different mute buttons that we have over here in Flex. Note mute that would remove the note from the PDF. Price mute removes the price from the PDF. Line mute just removes the whole line from the PDF. But all of these, just because we're removing those things from the PDF, they're still being considered in availability. They're still showing as going to the total price of this job. You're basically just hiding them from the customer when you print out a PDF. The warehouse mute, on the other hand, if you click that box, it's going to tell Flex, don't even consider this item as actually being used from our inventory. That's such a powerful tool that we don't even enable it by default. So you see, I don't have a warehouse mute here right now. You can enable that though, and you can put it on any of these different views. I personally like to put it on the warehouse view, or maybe even the logistics view. And the way that you can do that is you go to Project Elements. We're going to double click Quote. And all those different views, those logistic views, warehouse views, all those different tabs along the top, you can change the way that those look. You can change the different options by going to the Document Views tab here. And let's say Warehouse View. Double click that, and I want to enable Warehouse Mute. Yes. Click Update, but then I have to update again to update the whole quote settings. But what I have now is when I go to my warehouse view, I have a warehouse mute. Now keep in mind, this could potentially be a little bit dangerous. So for example, let's look at this Sanyo projector schedule. Right now, it's showing between those dates, I'm using 4 out of my 10. Over here, it goes back up to 9 out of 10. Look at what happens when I go to this quote and when I hit warehouse mute for that line item. When I reload the schedule, that warehouse mute is essentially just telling Flex, I'm not using that item. And I'm sorry, I made a mistake there because I already have a pull sheet created for this. So the pull sheet is already creating conflicts. But if I had a new quote that didn't have a pull sheet on it, I might just have to create one from scratch. So really this only works if you don't have the pull sheet created already, because if that item got put on a pull sheet, the pull sheet is creating conflicts for that item. Let's maybe use this Behringer X32 for example. I already have a conflict there, but if I go and say warehouse mute this item, I'm not actually taking this item from my own stock. I don't want to create a rental PO, but I know I'm getting that from somewhere else. I click warehouse mute. First of all, look what happens. The conflict goes away because this item is no longer being considered as creating conflicts because I hit warehouse mute. If I look at the schedule, First of all, look at how it's going to change. If I go back and disable that warehouse mute, and then go back and reload that schedule, I also have to make sure this quote is confirmed. Sorry, I haven't done this in a minute, so there's a few steps that I had to go through. But if I confirm that quote, then let's look at this schedule. So now between those dates, I'm showing a -2. But if I warehouse mute and reload that schedule, Flex no longer considers that. Even though this quote is in confirmed, Flex doesn't consider this item being taken from availability because I warehouse muted it. And if I go create a pull sheet, this item's not going to show up on the pull sheet. So again, you may or may not ever use that, but warehouse mute basically just says this line item is not being taken from our stock. Maybe it's just there for display purposes for the customer. Maybe the venue has this item, so I just don't need it, but I still want to charge the customer, or at least show them that they're getting something. Maybe I'm renting it. There's any number of reasons why you might warehouse mute this item so that it's not taken into availability calculations or show up on the pull sheet. But again, I like to enable that on a separate tab just so that somebody doesn't accidentally hit warehouse mute when they're trying to hit like note mute or total mute or something else. Because if they do accidentally hit warehouse mute and then go create a pull sheet, this item's not going to show up on that pull sheet. So it can be a little dangerous, but if you put it in the right place, you can manage how people use it. Okay, so that was pretty much the sub-rental process, the basics, followed by some of the more deep settings and some best practices. I know that was quite a bit, so I will get this recording up on our YouTube page so that you can look at it again and review. But hopefully that was helpful and show you just some of the capabilities that Flex has in doing rental POs and things like that. If you want some more tips and advice about the sub-rental process, I always recommend going to our forum where there's a bunch of users who are just discussing things about Flex. You could get some tips and advice from people who have gone through a lot of these different things. If you're having some more technical issues, you can email support@flexrentalsolutions.com.